Hey guys, tonight we step into a story that feels both icy and strangely unreal. Imagine the bustling harbour of Haithabu, one of the Viking Age's greatest trading hubs alive, with the sounds of wooden hulls knocking together, sailors shouting across the docks, and merchants hawking furs, amber and silver. Then in a single night that entire harbour hardens into a sheet of ice so thick that not even an axe can bite through. Ships that should be riding the tide are instead sealed in place as if the sea itself has turned to stone. It's a scene as chilling as it sounds, and you probably wouldn't last long if you tried walking barefoot on that frost. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love picturing this little community of night owls and early risers scattered across the world. Now find yourself a cozy seat or a soft bed. Let your mind begin to unwind, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The harbour of Haithabu sits at the base of the Schlei Inlet near what is today Schleswig in northern Germany. In the Viking Age, this place was a marvel of activity, a crossroads of trade linking the Baltic Sea to the North Sea. Archaeologists have uncovered vast evidence of workshops, wharves and longhouses, proof that Haithabu thrived between the 8th and 11th centuries. They've also found traces of merchants from far-off lands, slaves from the East, coins from Arabia, beads from as far south as Byzantium. Yet for all its prosperity, Haithabu was not immune to the hand of nature. On this particular winter's eve, the weather turned sharply. Villagers recall how the wind carried an unusual bite, the kind that seemed to rattle through bone rather than skin. By morning, what should have been brackish water swelling with tide was now a wide mirror of white. A glaze of ice stretched from bank to bank. Ships that had anchored in the harbour, sturdy longships meant for crossing oceans, sat motionless, their hulls imprisoned. Sailors scrambled across decks bewildered. Some tested the surface with spears only to see the tips snap. Others laughed nervously, joking that Thor must have misplaced his hammer in the bay, freezing everything solid. Historians still argue whether this was a freak weather event, a local microclimate shift, or something stranger. The region, after all, lies in a place where cold snaps are possible, but what puzzles scholars is the sheer suddenness of it. Accounts suggest the harbour froze overnight with no gradual build-up. That alone has fueled centuries of debate, from natural disaster theories to whispers of the supernatural. As the morning sun rose, the townsfolk gathered at the shoreline. Men and women alike pressed against the bank, staring at the trapped fleet. Traders who had intended to set sail for Ribe or head by markets instead found themselves trapped by an unyielding sheet of ice. Fishermen grumbled that their nets once cast into flowing water now lay useless. Children, ever braver than sense allows, dared one another to step onto the frozen surface. The crunch beneath their boots sent shivers through onlookers who feared the ice might crack or, worse, never melt. The harbour of Haithabu had always been a place of noise and motion, where gulls screamed overhead and oars splashed rhythmically. Now it was wrapped in silence. Even the birds seemed to vanish. Some villagers muttered about omens. Was this a punishment from the gods for trading too freely with foreign lands? Had Odin himself cast down a shroud of ice to remind mortals of their fragility? Priests of the old faith argued it was divine will, while newer Christian converts whispered about trials sent by their god. The ice carried its own eerie qualities. Sailors swore they could hear faint groaning noises from beneath, as if something alive moved under the surface. Others claimed to see lights flicker within like distant torches trapped below the frozen harbour. Whether it was merely the play of sun on cracks, or something less explainable, no one could quite agree. Modern scientists looking back speculate that sudden freezes could be triggered by unusual atmospheric events, volcanic dust clouds cooling the air, or sudden inflows of fresh water lowering the freezing point. Yet even with these ideas, the case of Haithabu remains baffling. The archaeological record doesn't reveal clear signs of such an occurrence, only scattered mentions in later chronicles. And so the mystery lingers. For the villagers living through it, mystery was not an academic exercise. It was survival. How long would the ice last? Would trade routes collapse? Would the frozen harbour become a tomb for their ships? Already the smell of pine tar and pitch, once comforting from the shipwrights' yards, now seemed sour against the chill. That first day of the freeze, the people of Haithabu watched, waited and whispered. Some laughed nervously, others prayed, and still more began to wonder if they had awakened not in their village, but in some strange tale sung by skalds. The frozen harbour was more than an inconvenience. It was the opening note of a story that no one in the town would ever forget. The second morning after the harbour froze, Haithabu woke not to the cheerful din of merchants haggling or sailors preparing their sails, but to the muffled crunch of boots on frost-hardened earth. The entire shoreline had transformed into something uncanny. Ships that only days before bobbed freely on the tide were now fixed in place like children's toys forgotten in ice. Traders stood ashore helpless, staring at their livelihoods, held hostage by nature or by something stranger. They had come here with treasures, with wool and furs from the north, with silver coins meant for exchange, with casks of mead and with jars of salted fish. All of it now sat trapped aboard ships they could not reach. The laughter that usually floated across the docks had thinned into uneasy murmurs. It was a cruel irony the very success of Haithabu depended on movement, on goods flowing in and out. This town had been a hub precisely because it never stood still. Yet now everything was frozen in the most literal sense. Some tried to maintain optimism. Surely the ice would melt in a day two at most. After all, the Schlei was tidal and brackish. It should not have frozen so completely. But as the sun rose higher and the ice did not soften, hope began to shrink. Among those stranded were merchants from distant lands. A man from Frisia, wrapped in layers of dyed wool, shouted angrily that his cargo of cloth would mould before spring. A trader from the east worried that the wax he carried for candles would crack in the cold. They complained in their own tongues, and though not everyone understood the message, was clear frustration, fear, and the growing sense that this was no ordinary frost. Historians still debate whether this event was remembered because it disrupted trade, or because it hinted at something supernatural. To the locals, however, the two explanations were not mutually exclusive. If the gods had cursed them, they had done so through the most practical means by shutting down the beating heart of commerce. Without trade, food would be scarcer. Silver would not flow, and alliances forged through exchange would weaken. For people of the Viking Age, survival was always tied to networks, and a frozen harbour could unravel them. Some sailors tried their luck venturing onto the ice to retrieve small crates. They dragged sledges improvised from planks across the surface. From a distance it looked comical hulking men tiptoeing like cautious children balancing precious cargo. One slipped, sending a foray of imported oil skittering. The shards sparkled on the ice like stars. He cursed loudly, though the wind quickly swallowed his words. A few villagers chuckled, not unkindly. Even in the strangest times, people find ways to laugh. Yet the situation was no joke. The older townsfolk muttered that the harbour had never frozen in living memory not like this. Fishermen spoke of hearing hollow knocks beneath the surface as though the water itself still moved but could not break free. One whispered to his neighbour that he had seen a fish suspended mid-swim trapped inside the ice as if in glass. Whether that was true or the invention of a restless mind, it spread quickly, making children squeal and adults cross themselves or call upon Thor for protection. The scholarly tidbit that lingers today is that Haithabu lay on the boundary between climates. Severe cold snaps could happen, though rarely. But historians still argue whether such a sudden freeze was possible, without unusual conditions, a volcanic eruption, lowering temperatures perhaps, or a sudden flush of fresh water creating the perfect environment for ice. The mystery endures because the story does not read like gradual winter. It reads like enchantment. For the stranded merchants, superstition offered as much comfort as science. Some claim the Christian god was testing them. Others insisted the old gods had grown jealous of their prosperity. A few joked darkly that Loki trickster as ever had thrown a blanket over the harbour just to watch them squirm. Humour helped pass the hours, though each passing day of ice made those jokes thinner. By evening, the town square filled with arguments. Should they try to hack channels through the ice to free the ships? Should they abandon cargo and carry what they could overland? Or should they simply wait, trusting the Thor? Opinions split sharply. Men waved axes and declared they could carve the harbour open within days. Others rolled their eyes. How could a handful of villagers undo what had entombed dozens of ships overnight? The town's children, meanwhile, found joy in the absurd. They skated with bones strapped to their feet, inventing games on the frozen surface. Their laughter rang across the bay, piercing the grim atmosphere. Parents watched with mixed emotions, relief that their children were smiling, fear that the ice might crack beneath them. Yet it did not crack. It held. As night fell once more, families huddled inside longhouses warmed by peat fires, listening to the groans of the ice outside. The sound echoed through the wooden beams like the voice of some slumbering giant. Mothers told their children stories of Jörmungandr, the great serpent who circled the world, and wondered aloud if he had brushed against the harbour in his endless coils. Fathers stared into the fire, calculating silently how many days their supplies might last if trade remained cut off. Even the dogs seemed restless, scratching at doors and howling into the frozen night. The frozen harbour was more than scenery, it became a character in the unfolding drama. Each day it taunted the people of Haithabu, offering a smooth surface that was beautiful in the winter sun, yet merciless in what it trapped. The merchants who had come here expecting profit now muttered about loss. And still as the second day ended, the ships creaked softly in their icy prisons, as though groaning with the weight of uncertainty. The town drifted into uneasy sleep, not knowing that the real troubles were only beginning. Rumours move faster than cold wind in a Viking town, and by the third day of the harbour's imprisonment, Haithabu is thick with speculation. The ice itself becomes the market's loudest vendor, selling 100 explanations at once, none of them discounted, and all of them contradictory. One tale says Odin grows displeased with the town's ambition, that the old god has pressed his palm upon the water until it turns solid. Another insists Loki has thrown a prank like a cloak across the bay purely to watch traders stomp their feet. A woman who sells herbs on the edge of the square swears she saw a cloaked figure the night before, the frieze hands lifted toward the inlet as if plucking invisible strings. By morning that figure has acquired a fur-lined hood from Finnmark, a staff tipped with iron, and a shadow that stretches the length of the dock. Stories gain detail the way frost gains crystals. Superstition has its own tidy logic. If gods can sink kings, why not silence a harbour? If wise men in the far north can speak with spirits, why not sing ice into being? In Haithabu myth and morning chores, live side by side, a person can recount Thor shattering giants by firelight, then dawn walk to the quay and hammer real iron nails with a perfectly practical arm. No one finds that strange. What they find strange is this ice that arrives, as if poured from a bucket, smooth, hard and stubborn. Those who venture onto it swear it sounds hollow, as though a long drum is beating underneath. A smith kneels, taps with a mallet and mutters, "It is at least 15 centimetres thick, about 6 inches, then taps again and amends it to nearer 20 centimetres, about 8 inches, where the water runs deepest numbers that make parents snatch children back from the edge. The town's priests press their advantages. A Christian deacon, young, serious and miserably cold, calls for confession and humility, insisting the freeze is a chastening. He quotes scripture, his teeth chattering so hard the consonants turn into tiny icicles. The pagan god he counters in even tones that pride angers Odin and neglect angers Njord. Offerings must be made. Not a living thing, he adds carefully. Bread mead honey, and carved runes cast upon the boundary where ice meets land. He points to the wind veering north, and claims it is a sign of what someone asks. That the wind veers north, he replies. Even the faithful laugh at that, and the deacon who understands a good line when he hears one almost smiles. Laughter helps. A fisherman says the curse clearly targets price gougers first. If your grain keeps its price, the gods must like you. A weaver complains that if divine punishment had to arrive, it could have chosen something more considerate, like turning the mead slightly weak instead of freezing everyone's income solid. A Frisian trader, famous for grumbling, announces that his crates of cloth will decay before spring. A boat builder retorts that the gods obviously dislike Frisians the most, given how loudly they protest. Even the Frisian chuckles, which is how you know nerves have not snapped entirely. 3 jokes in people breathe easier. 3 jokes later, they pull their cloaks tighter because the wind remembers to sting. Inside, Longhouse's rumour turns cosy and extravagant. Children crowd near peat fires while elders embroider the tale. A skald says he heard a low bellow from under the bay, as if a sleeping creature rolled over. A grandmother claims the housecat refuses to cross the threshold facing the harbour, sitting like a furry oracle, and blinking slow disapproval at whoever tries to move it. A boy swears he saw tiny letters in the hoarfrost on the window runes appearing and vanishing when he breathed on the glass. He tries to draw them for proof, but the letters he scratches end up meaning goatail and shoe, which makes everyone laugh except the boy who insists that Frost has terrible handwriting. The mainstream fact that anchors these fancies is that Haithabu truly sits on a crossroads of faiths and peoples in the Viking Age, with both pagan rites and Christian practice recorded, and with traders arriving from Frisia, the Slavic coasts, and even far to the east. This mingling is ordinary here. What is not ordinary is the suddenness of the freeze. Historians still argue whether any natural combination, sharp cold front, a surge of fresh water from inland streams, and a perfectly still night could turn a tidal brackish harbour to stone between sunset and dawn. Some propose volcanic dust high in the atmosphere could have dropped temperatures swiftly. Others doubt that dust alone could make a mirror of the bay so fast. The debate like the ice does not budge. Out on the surface, yesterday's children who strapped bones to their feet for play now glide in solemn loops, older siblings pacing beside them as involuntary escorts. Bone skates are nothing new in the north. Archaeologists will one day dig them from mud and marvel, but the way the children move today looks more like a small ritual than a game. Their laughter is still there, thinner perhaps, but real. Parents call out distances, not beyond 30 metres, about 98 feet, because even in mystery boundaries help. The wind bites at -10 degrees Celsius, about 14 degrees Fahrenheit by someone's rough guess, and though no one owns a thermometer, everyone knows the feeling when breath turns to powder. A quirky tidbit takes hold: a barrel of pickled herring rolled onto the ice, and after hours in the cold made a noise like a flute when someone pried the lid. A prudent person would say expanding air escaped with a musical squeal. A less prudent person would say the harbour sings when fed. Before nightfall, 3 more barrels accidentally lose their lids. The wind whistles, people clap, the deacon kindly calls it a draught, the goddy calls it a blessing, the crowd calls it a good story and tells it again louder. Meanwhile, accusations sharpen like the edge of a chisel. A few point at the wealthiest merchants, accusing them of greed that offends heaven. The merchants point back, suggesting that someone's secret hoard of silver has cursed the town with envy. An old mariner mutters that longships measure 20 to 25 metres, about 66 to about 82 feet, for a reason they prefer waves to prisons. He says it softly, as if the boats can hear, and pats a railing locked in ice. No one ridicules him. Everyone has started speaking to ships and doors and stoves just to be safe. Even practical minds try to translate myth into action. If the gods are angry, perhaps a procession will soothe them. If sorcery has done this, a countercharm might help. The goddy proposes a simple rite: bread and honey set on the ice. At 9 points around the bay, mead poured in small libations and a ring of ash branches laid where the ice meets shore. The deacon suggests a vigil through the night, candles cupped in hands, prayers whispered so the flame does not die. Both plans are adopted because no one wants to say no to either god when the bay looks like a polished shield. Quietly, people agree not to mention horses or blood. No one wants children to learn those older stories tonight. The town elects mercy as its ritual, which is a pleasant surprise to everyone, including the skald who pockets 3 rhymes at once. As twilight gathers, the harbour turns a solemn blue, then a luminous charcoal reflecting the first stars. The processions step out. At each of the 9 points, someone places bread and honey, then pours mead that wisps to crystal as it touches the surface. Candles ripple in mittened hands along the shore road toward the church. From the ridge above, the scene looks like a necklace of small fires trying to warm a giant recalcitrant jewel. A baby laughs at the flicker. Somewhere a dog answers with a subdued arf that pretends to be brave and does a decent job of it. Modern scholars peering back through time's fog propose a gentle reading rituals help communities cohere under stress. Whether or not rites change weather, they do steady hearts. And yet even modern writing cannot quite file the incident down to psychology alone. The town's own memory insists the ice arrives too quickly, stays too clean, and hides too many small sounds to be only weather. The scholarly phrase you still encounter is simple and stubborn. Researchers still debate whether the phenomenon can be fully explained by known climatic dynamics, or whether cultural memory layered it with the supernatural beyond recognition. That sentence is the academic version of shrugging at a riddle, and saying politely that the riddle has good manners and intends to stay. Night deepens, the candles gutter, the mead freezes, the bread grows slick with frost, and the ring of ash branches lies like a soft wreath against the edge of the bay. The ice gleams indifferent, beautiful and infuriating. The jokes have run their useful course. The prayers have done their comforting work. The charms rest where they were laid. People drift home in 2s and 3s. Behind them, the harbour holds its breath. If someone hears a low chime from far under the surface, they say nothing. They have learned that some sounds are better stored than shared, at least until morning. By the 4th day of the freeze, the people of Haithabu shifted from wonder and rumour to a stubborn kind of action. No one liked to stand idle while their fortunes sat locked beneath a sheet of glittering ice. The first attempts were bold, even reckless. Fishermen brought axes, the same tools they used for splitting oak planks, and marched to the harbour with the grim determination of men who believe brute force solves most problems. They hacked at the surface in great swinging blows. The first strikes rang out like bells splintering the silence and sending sharp shards flying. But the ice seemed to laugh, barely scratched where the axes fell. Others brought iron wedges, chisels, even heavy hammers from the smithy. They hammered holes shallow and frustrating, only to watch them refill with hard frost before they could widen them. One man heated a spear tip in the forge and pressed it against the ice, only to find that the metal cooled so quickly it hissed uselessly and left little more than a black smudge. His companions snickered, though the laughter faded when they realised how determined the ice was to remain. Still, the community refused to give up. Sailors tried prying at the edges near the bank, hoping to free their moored ships first. They discovered that the ice thickened toward the middle, as if some hand had pressed hardest there. In some places it measured nearly 30 centimetres, about 12 inches, far thicker than anyone expected from one night of frost. The sheer volume of it was daunting. Merchants muttered that even a week of chopping would barely free a single longship. Historians still argue whether these attempts were more symbolic than practical. Some scholars suggest the people of Haithabu simply needed to be seen resisting, proving to one another that they were not defeated by the elements. Others note that Vikings were used to tackling the impossible. To chip at ice was no stranger than to row across a storm. Yet the record of futility remains. Every tool dulled, every wedge bent, every strong back grew weary without progress. Quirky tidbits of improvisation peppered these efforts. One farmer poured buckets of ash over a patch of ice, convinced the dark powder would attract the sun and melt it. All it did was stain the surface grey so that later children played tic-tac-toe in the soot. Another man lit a fire atop a barrel and rolled it onto the bay, believing heat would open a channel. Instead, the barrel sank halfway into the surface, wedged so firmly that the townsfolk left it as a new landmark. For weeks afterward, children called it the Burned Barrel Beacon and used it to mark the start line for their bone skate races. Modern scientists reading these stories point to the stubborn properties of ice under freezing winds. The harder the people worked, the faster their sweat cooled, the more the chill stiffened their fingers. Even fire and ash are no match when temperatures drop below -15 degrees Celsius, about 5 degrees Fahrenheit. But to the people living it, no scientific reasoning mattered. They saw themselves in a battle with something alive, a force that resisted every blow. Amid the frustration, humour still poked through. A sailor muttered that the ice clearly preferred their cargo, wanting to hoard silver and mead for itself. Another declared that at least they would not have to worry about their goods spoiling the harbour, was now the largest seller in Scandinavia. A smith quipped that if the ice did not crack soon, he might start forging skates instead of axes. The jokes drew weary chuckles, the kind that melt briefly before freezing again. Arguments, however, simmered beneath the surface. Merchants accused townsfolk of laziness, claiming that if every able-bodied man worked, the ice would yield. Locals snapped back that outsiders had brought the curse with them. The Godi cautioned against anger, warning that fury only thickened the spell. The deacon countered that anger was sin, but secretly admitted he was angry too, mostly at his frostbitten toes. The debates grew louder, but the harbour remained as silent as ever, indifferent to human quarrels. By the end of the day, the shoreline looked battered. Axes lay dulled, wedges bent, and wooden sledges broken. Yet the ice still stretched unbroken across the bay, gleaming in the last light of the sun. The sound of hammering and chopping had faded to a tired quiet. Families trudged home, shoulders slumped, carrying their ruined tools like defeated soldiers. The harbour groaned softly in the evening as though mocking their efforts. Inside longhouses the talk turned grim. Supplies were calculated more carefully. How long could the town survive without the fish that usually poured in from the harbour? How many weeks could salted meat and grain sustain them before hunger grew sharp? Children still played, still laughed at the Burned Barrel Beacon, but their parents' eyes grew heavier with worry. The reality of the freeze was sinking deeper than the axes ever could, and so the fourth day closed on futility. The people of Haithabu had tried to fight the ice with every tool at hand, and the ice had answered with silence. It was an opponent that did not bleed, did not tire, did not break. As darkness settled, the villagers pulled furs tighter and prayed not for victory but for mercy. By the fifth day of the freeze, Haithabu begins to sound wrong, in a way that feels intimate, as if the town's heartbeat slips a beat and everyone hears it. The usual harbour music, oars thumping hulls, gulls bickering and the windship ropes creaking, has vanished, replaced by a hush so complete that people listen to it the way they would a story. The ice does not merely sit, it speaks. It ticks like cooling iron, it moans in long threads, and sometimes it cracks with a whip-sharp report that ricochets from bank to bank and leaves men blinking as though someone shouted their names. Even the children who used to skate figure eights around the burned barrel beacon pause at the edge, now heads tilted, deciding whether the bay is a stage or a throat. In daylight the sounds are mechanical small clicks, distant sighs, but at night they gather into patterns. A fisherman's wife swears she hears 3 slow knocks, silence, then 3 again like a coded message from below. A boat builder, stout and sensible, presses his ear to the surface and claims there is a faint rushing, as if a river still runs in darkness under glass. The story spreads quickly. The water is breathing beneath a lid. When the lid settles, it hums. When it shivers, it sings. A child whispers that the bay has turned into a trapped drum and begs to know who is holding the sticks. No one answers. Animals take their own counsel. Dogs bristle at the waterline and refuse to touch their noses to the rim. Horses pull up short and roll their eyes, choosing a longer road rather than past the quay. The town's geese, noisy, bossy, impossible to ignore, lift one dawn in a white ribbon and do not come back. People mutter that beasts feel what men pretend not to feel. The absence of honking feels like a joke stolen from the day. Humour limps without it. Inside storehouses the freeze grows a private vocabulary. A jar of honey gives up and bursts with a crystalline sigh, its contents spider-webbing into amber plates across a plank floor. The keeper swears he hears a single clear tone at the instant it breaks a sound so pure he looks round for a harp. His neighbours test 2 more jars purely for scientific rigour, and those 2 shatter with eerie delicacy. Afterward nobody wants honey on bread for a while, which is not a tragedy but is a mood. A mainstream historical fact sits quietly beneath all this. Haithabu is a true hub in the Viking Age, ringed by great earthworks, and near the Danevirke with jetties, workshops and a busy market that draws Frisian Slavs and traders from farther east. Archaeology will show a semicircular rampart traces of piers and bustling craft quarters. It is no small thing then when such a place falls silent. The stillness feels like the lights of a city switching off at once. Historians still argue whether the acoustic strangeness people describe could come only from natural causes, ice expanding, wind shearing across frozen panes, temperature inversions bending sound, or whether later memory embroidered the facts with fear until noises became messages. The phrase returns like a refrain. Researchers still debate whether the phenomenon can be fully explained by known climatic dynamics. The debate, like the ice, lingers. Practical minds try to measure what they cannot influence. A smith taps a steel spike through the rim and judges the thickness near 30 centimetres, about 12 inches, by the resistance and the length of the wetted metal. A net maker walks the edge and paces a stretch of stillness, marks it at 25 metres, about 82 feet, and tells a boy no farther. The boy nods solemnly, and being a boy nudges the boundary one cautious boot length anyway. Someone estimates the air at minus 12 degrees Celsius, about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, by the sting in the nose and the way spilled water powders before it pools. No one owns a thermometer, but everyone owns a face that knows. Life narrows into careful routines. Longhouses burn peat and brush from dawn to dark. Smoke crawls along the eaves and drifts flat before surrendering to the sky. Families count stores, again sacks of barley salt meat, a few wheels of cheese. Someone weighs a sledge of provisions at perhaps 50 kilograms, about 110 pounds, and decides they can share with an old neighbour for another week. Children are told to keep games close to the door and voices soft after dusk. Even laughter is folded warm and thin like a blanket saved for guests. The clergy offer words for the hush. The young deacon calls for a vigil and says the silence is a mirror in which faults are easy to see. His candles gutter in the draughts, and everyone kindly pretends not to notice when he warms his fingers over them between prayers. The Godi who dislikes scolding tells another story when the world serpent shifts. In sleep water holds its breath, and the secret is to breathe very steadily until the serpent settles again. He demonstrates slow breaths, and for once the churchgoers and the faithful of the old ways copy the same rhythm without argument. It makes people drowsy, and small mercy less afraid. 3 jokes do their bit to prop the evening up. A blacksmith says the silence is the best news his ears have heard since his cousin decided he could sing. Several hands clap while the cousin bows with wounded dignity. A trader announces that at least thieves cannot row away with his goods this week, though if the ice develops legs he will sue. A seamstress suggests charging admission to the world's largest quiet, and promises half the money to the church and half to the Godi, which she adds sweetly, is still 0. Even the deacon laughs. The Godi laughs twice. Jokes are not a cure, but they are good medicine. Quirky little rituals bloom at the edge of the bay, polite rather than grim. Women sprinkle breadcrumbs along the rim for the small spirits that hate to be left out. Old men set chips of birch in a tidy line to give the wind something to count. Children cup their hands against the ice and hum at different pitches to learn which makes the surface answer. One girl finds a note that sets a whole sheet to a faint sympathetic shiver. Suddenly the edges are choir. The deacon calls it charming and asks them to stop after sunset. The Godi calls it clever and asks them to stop after sunset. They agree, and the parents blink at the miracle of unanimity. As twilight gathers frost flowers, delicate starbursts of ice bloom on the flat panes near shore. They are tiny and astonishing geometries of breath and cold, and they soften the menace of the bay into something that can be admired without fear. A skald lingers to memorize the pattern and quietly composes a line about a garden where petals never wilt. The line is too pretty to keep, so it travels as pretty lines do, and before long even the anxious repeat it in their heads while stirring stew. Modern voices peering back prefer patient explanations. Ice speaks because crystals grow and slip. The bay becomes a sounding board. Temperature gradients bend sound around corners. Animals flee because their instincts tally risks faster than words can. All sensible, all useful. Yet anyone who has lived through a winter night of peculiar sounds knows how quickly sense seeds ground to wonder at 2 a.m. In Haithabu, wonder claims most of the map. By full dark, the town tiptoes. Doors close softly. The last walkers tread the shore road in pairs. Somewhere a lone hammer gives a polite tap and quits. The burned barrel beacon sits half sunk and solemn. Breath plumes hang a moment, then drift away like small tired ghosts. A mother lays a hand on a sleeping child's brow. A father listens, finds nothing to fix, and listens harder. The harbour holds its shimmering, spacious quiet as if silence were an element that can accumulate thickening like frost on wool. And then near midnight a sound like faraway glass rings once pure, weightless, dignified, and dissolves into the cold. No one agrees later on its source. Some say it is ice shifting along a crack. Some say a pin of frost finally snapping on a ship's rail. Some shrug and let it be a bell that travels without a tower. Whatever the cause, the note threads the longhouses and people, sigh in the dark as if the harbour itself has exhaled. The quiet that follows feels gentler, as though the bay, satisfied to have the last word, allows the town to sleep. On the 6th day, the silence of Haithabu's harbour was broken not by the townsfolk themselves, but by strangers. Word of the frozen bay had travelled quickly along the roads, and waterways, for no oddity in the Viking world, remained secret for long. By morning, the first group of curious visitors arrived, travellers from nearby settlements, bundled in heavy cloaks stamping frost from their boots. They had come as witnesses, eager to see for themselves the harbour sealed in unnatural stillness. Haithabu, once merely a trade hub, had become a spectacle. The newcomers gasped at the sight of longships locked into the ice, their proud, dragon-headed prows tilted as though straining for freedom. Some knelt to touch the surface, laughing nervously at how solid it felt beneath their fingers. One Frisian merchant, who had not yet grown tired of complaining, declared it proof that the gods despised all traders alike. His companions, unimpressed, replied that perhaps the gods simply disliked him in particular. Such bickering amused the townsfolk, who welcomed any chance for humour, even at the expense of visitors. As the day stretched on, more outsiders appeared. Word had reached across the Danevirk, and down the trade routes Haithabu's harbour had frozen overnight, and people were saying it would not thaw. Traders on their way to Ribe paused to see it. Pilgrims bound for distant shrines diverted to Gork. Wandering skalds rubbed their hands with glee, sensing new material for songs. Soon the banks grew crowded with Gorkers murmuring and gesturing at the spectacle, as though it were a giant stage set for a play. Historians still argue how many actually came, though records suggest the numbers were not small. The phenomenon was too rare to ignore. Naturalists and chroniclers alike would later describe the sudden freeze in their writings, though none could explain it fully. Scholars today propose that some reports may have been exaggerated by retelling, yet they also concede that when news spreads of a miracle or a disaster, people will travel far just to say they stood there. Among the visitors was a group of monks travelling from the south. Wrapped in rough woolen habits, they peered at the harbour with furrowed brows. One scribbled notes with a stylus on wax, muttering about signs and wonders. Another murmured that it might be a divine punishment, while a third suggested it could be an opportunity. What better way to show the weakness of the old gods than to display a frozen harbour at the edge of their world? Their comments earned dark looks from the pagan locals, though the visitors seemed not to notice. Quirky tales blossomed around these foreign observers. One skald claimed a traveller from Francia tried to skate across the bay on iron cooking pans strapped to his boots. He made it a few staggering paces before toppling, sliding on his back like a seal, until villagers pulled him to safety. Children howled with laughter, repeating the scene in mimed reenactments for days afterward. Another story tells of a Saxon merchant who, frustrated at losing his cargo to the ice, hurled a sack of flour onto the surface. The flour burst, scattering white powder across the snow, and the locals joked that the harbour now wanted to bake bread. Amid the novelty, unease lingered. Foreign eyes carried foreign judgments, and Haithabu's people knew their reputation mattered. A thriving harbour was proof of strength of prosperity. To have it locked in silence made them appear cursed, vulnerable or weak. Some muttered that the strangers would carry tales of weakness back to rivals. Others worried that too many Gawkers would consume what little resources remained. Yet no one turned them away. Vikings valued guests, even inconvenient ones, and besides they hoped that someone among them might bring wisdom, or at least a new theory. The mainstream fact is that Haithabu truly was a crossroads where many cultures met. Archaeological evidence shows traders from the east bringing beads, silver and even silk, while men from the west carried wool and glassware. To have outsiders present in the town during the freeze is no stretch of imagination. It was already a place where foreigners were as common as locals. That the mystery of the ice drew even more is entirely believable. As twilight fell, the gathered crowd grew quiet. The ice groaned, once a deep rolling sound like a drum beneath the earth. Travellers gasped, clutching cloaks tighter, while locals exchanged knowing looks. Some crossed themselves, others whispered to Odin. The sound faded, leaving only the faint whimper of the wind. Strangers shivered at the eerie stillness, murmuring that they would remember this night for the rest of their lives. The townsfolk, for their part, had already begun to grow weary of explaining, of shrugging, of pretending the mystery was not gnawing at them too. Yet even in weariness humour clung. A boy whispered loudly enough for the crowd to hear, "If the harbour does not melt soon, perhaps we can charge silver for tours." His mother cuffed his ear, but not before a dozen strangers chuckled and murmured that they might just pay. The Goddy shook his head in mock despair while the deacon muttered something about the sin of greed. But no one denied that the idea held a certain charm. By night's end, fires dotted the banks as both locals and visitors lingered to watch the strange silent harbour. It glittered under starlight, a flat mirror broken only by the prows of imprisoned ships. The scene looked almost deliberate, as though crafted by some unseen hand to bewilder and enthrall. Haithabu had become a place of pilgrimage not for relics or saints, but for ice. And with every new visitor, every fresh pair of eyes staring at the impossible, the legend grew. By the 7th day of the harbour's imprisonment, the problem is not mystery but merchandise. Haithabu is a living ledger, accounts balanced in salt and silver, and the numbers begin to go red. The bay still gleams like polished stone, but along the quay you can smell the arithmetic tar-brine damp wool and the first shy note of rot. People stop telling travellers how strange the ice looks and start asking one another how much they can afford to lose. They count aloud bales, barrels, amphorae, sacks, chests. They count again as if the totals might change if spoken more gently. Ships are storehouses with masts, and their storehouses are sealed shut. Barrels that should breathe cool air now sit clamped in the holds like stifled throats. Someone pries up a hatch with a lever, and a prayer finds a cargo of fish packed in salt that has crusted to stone. He thumps the topmost layer and it rings like a small shield. Another crew chips at ice that has crept into the seams, discovers a line of hair-thin frost running down the interior like a spiderweb made of glass. A third crew opens a chest of cloth and finds the wool faintly damp. The merchant closes the lid at once, as though the act of looking caused the harm. He measures the chest with his eye, 1.5 meters, about 5 feet long, perhaps 50 kilograms, about 110 pounds. When dry, now heavier from hidden moisture and swallows. Damp turns wealth into compost. The mainstream historical fact, steady as a keel in swell, is that Haithabu truly functions as one of Northern Europe's great emporiums in the Viking Age. Archaeologists will find Arabic dirhams beads traced to the Black Sea fragments of silk that once crossed empires and proof of specialised crafts along the jetties. When a place like this seizes up, the shock travels outward along every route. It is not just a local mishap, it is a knot tied in the belt that holds many markets together. Salvage begins as prudence and slides toward quarrel. The town tries to make rules on the fly. 2 witnesses for every removal, says the Godi. A written tally in wax for each item, says the deacon. A fair share to the crew who risk the ice, say the sailors who plan to risk it anyway. Witnesses and wax sound excellent until wind impatience and dusk arrive. Then a man decides that if he takes only a small bundle, he is really borrowing from misfortune, not stealing from a neighbour. His neighbour decides to borrow back. The number of witnesses mysteriously drops to 1, then 2, I think I saw him, and finally to, everyone knows he is honest, which is the sentence that appears right before no one is. Historians still argue whether looting becomes a true plague during the freeze, or whether anxious memory exaggerates a few shabby episodes. Codes of honour travel with Viking crews, reputations are cargo too, and men guard them with more zeal than mead. Yet hardship is a cunning advocate. Even good people explain themselves beautifully while doing what they swore they would never do. The record, like the ice, refuses a single clean crack. Quirky tidbits because people always collect curiosities, while their fortunes leak sprout at every turn. A wheel of hard cheese lashed to a sledge for safety rolls off anyway when the sledge hits a ridge and goes trundling across the bay with the stateliness of a moon. Children sprint after it cheering until an aunt with a voice like a ship's whistle recalls them to the bank. A crate of glass beads pried open too eagerly spills its treasure into a glittering fan. For an afternoon the harbour looks jewelled, and for 3 days afterward travellers kneel on the ice to pluck gems that turn out to be someone else's profit dispersed by carelessness. A barrel of dried apples, famous in a small way, freezes hard. When a boy taps one disc against another, they clink like coins. He grins and declares the gods have made apple silver, then yelps when his tooth disagrees. Practical experiments multiply. A merchant weighs a sack of grain, roughly 30 kilograms, about 66 pounds, and decides he can carry 2 if he rests every 20 paces, about 66 feet. A boat builder measures a safe path from shore to his ship at 40 metres, about 131 feet, by cutting notches in a stave and laying it down in leaps. 2 men make a harness for a barrel of oil, estimating its volume near 200 litres, about 53 gallons. They pull slide gasp and finally leave the thing to sulk halfway to safety, where it becomes a conversational landmark called the Patient Cask. A smith spreads ashes on a root to darken the way, and he says, "Invite the sun." Clouds, indifferent to invitations, attend instead. The jokes required by any decent crisis keep punching above their weight. A fisherman announces that the harbour is doing him a kindness by keeping thieves from rowing away. A trader replies that the harbour is doing thieves a kindness by keeping him from rowing after them. A weaver declares she will design a new cloth called Ice Grey Panic because it matches everyone's face. A cooper vows to make barrels that never crack in the cold. Great news, he adds, for customers who promise never to live where winter happens. 3 laughs by another hour of patience. Beneath the humour, arithmetic continues. People add the days since the freeze to the days of salt each cargo can bear, subtract the time needed to open the holds divide by the number of strong backs that still volunteer for the ice and arrive at fractions that feel like omens. Someone scribbles rough columns in soot on a plankfish, hides wool grain, mead oil, timber furs. The soot smears, the figures smear, a sleeve smears, the math smears, the future smears. Even the neatest mind cannot keep the numbers clean when breath keeps fogging the slate. A few decisions try to turn crisis into economy. The town agrees to centralise the most perishable goods in a storehouse nearer the ridge, where wind scours the walls and keeps the interior colder than a grave. To move them, crews lash sledges into trains and count their loads aloud. First sledge, second sledge, third sledge, like prayers with ropes. A woman who bakes for the market modifies her dough to survive the cold, mixing less water and proofing near the hearth. With what honey remains unshattered, she glazes small loaves that cool crisp and keep longer. A skald tastes one and declares it a miracle of thrift. The baker declares it a miracle of not wasting flour. Conflicts sharpen where ownership blurs. Does fish aboard a foreigner's vessel become communal if it cannot be reached? Does wool on a local ship remain private if it is the only wool within walking distance? People who were excellent at minding their business last week become excellent at explaining why your business is currently their business. The Godi calls a meeting and speaks of balance. The deacon preaches fairness and warns that accounts written by heaven are not erased by snow. Both are right, and both are ignored in small, careful ways that let a person sleep after doing what they needed. The smell intensifies by evening a low, sour edge under the salt, the olfactory equivalent of a frown. Gulls, which ought to be haggling overhead, skate indecisively at the rim where water would be, then give up and stand about like bored accountants. A man lifts the lid on a cask of mead, discovers a plug of ice inside, and mutters that the drink has remembered how to behave. He chips the plug free, sniffs, and decides to keep the mead for church, which in this case includes the longhouse next door. Modern minds, peering backward, add possible causes to the ledger microclimate: freshwater influx, sudden inversion of cold, even long-distance volcanic haze gently knifing the temperature down. Each possibility gives shape to the weirdness, but does not stop meat from spoiling. Historians still argue whether the economic shock ripples outward for a season or a year, whether neighbouring ports profit from Haithabu's pause or share in its famine, whether the tale of the lost cargo became an emblem used by later chroniclers to moralise about greed. Debates note patterns. Mouths need food. The town thinks about dinners, not footnotes, and yet mercy creeps in the way warmth creeps from a small hearth into the far corners of a room. A family with extra barley because a cousin did not arrive slides a sack to a neighbour with the plausible excuse that it is too near the fire. A crew that saved its own catch wraps 2 smoked fish in cloth and leaves them on a threshold with no name on the parcel. A woman pressing felt for boots cuts 3 extra soles for the road, and somehow the road leads directly to 2 old men and a pregnant girl. People do not announce these acts. They simply do them, and then return to counting because counting looks less like crying. At full dark the harbour lies as before, a flat indifferent page where the day has scrawled sums that do not add neatly. The ships creak in tiny sleep-like motions. The burned barrel beacon keeps its quiet post. The patient cask waits halfway home. Somewhere on the ice a single bead gleams in moonlight, and no one sees it but the sky. Inside, families share thinner meals and thicker blankets. They speak softly as if loud voices might crack the wrong thing. The town has learned the cost of a frozen ledger. The numbers will not forgive quickly, but for tonight people forgive one another a little more than yesterday, and the harbour still and stony holds its silence like a closed hand around the last of their luck. On the 8th day the harbour of Haithabu changed again, not by breaking or thawing, but by the sudden strangeness of release. For a week the town had lived with the conviction that the ice would never yield, that the bay had been sealed into eternity. Then, in the span of a single night, the mirror cracked, not slowly, not predictably, but with the abruptness of a voice interrupting a sermon. By dawn, water pooled black between jagged sheets, and by midday ships rocked slightly in their prisons, free just enough to creak like sleepers stretching after a long, uncomfortable dream. The thaw arrived without warning. No warm wind swept in, no storm cracked the surface, no obvious sign signalled change. It simply happened as sudden as the freeze itself had been. People woke to hear the splintering, a brittle chorus that rolled across the harbour like applause. At first they thought the gods had struck again, punishing or forgiving, no one could decide which. But as the sun rose higher and the ice receded in long slabs, shock gave way to shouts, to laughter, to frantic movement along the shore. Historians still argue whether such a thaw is meteorologically possible, whether sudden currents or shifts in salinity could undo ice so swiftly. Some suggest the ice was never as thick as tales claim. Others note that brackish water can change state quickly under the right conditions. Yet even cautious scholars admit that the swiftness of the thaw remains as puzzling as the swiftness of the freeze. The event resists tidy explanation, leaving the story balanced between science and legend, a seesaw no one has managed to level. For the townsfolk, the debate mattered little. They rushed to reclaim their ships, clambering aboard decks that tilted unevenly as ice chunks floated free. Crews hauled lines, tested oars, and bellowed with relief when hulls shifted. Some wept openly, gripping rails as if embracing long-lost kin. Yet joy was tempered by the stink that rose from the holds. Barrels of fish had burst their contents spoiled, bales of wool had gone sour with damp, amphorae of oil leaked across the decks in slick rainbows. The harbour, once a ledger of wealth, now smelled like loss. Still the thaw itself felt like deliverance. A skald likened it to a prisoner's chains dissolving in mid-step. Children squealed as ice sheets cracked underfoot, sending them scrambling back to shore. Merchants raised hands skyward, praising gods old and new in the same breath. One man claimed he saw the face of Thor reflected in the shards, another insisted it was Christ. and a third said it looked suspiciously like his mother-in-law. Laughter rippled across the crowd, the kind that comes when tension finally snaps. Quirky tidbits peppered the day. A barrel once frozen into place drifted loose, spinning lazily, until it bumped the burned barrel beacon and knocked it askew. The town cheered as if watching a sporting contest, betting on which barrel would win the collision. Another tale tells of a goose returning, suddenly landing with such confusion on the fractured surface that it nearly toppled into a crack. Children chased it, declaring it the bravest bird in Haithabu, but joy could not erase the tally of loss. Goods lay ruined, silver exchanged for mould fish, for stench mead, for sour sludge. Merchants tallied their fortunes and cursed in every tongue known to the harbour. Some accused rivals of negligence, others swore they would abandon Haithabu for ports less cursed. Arguments flared, though none grew violent. Exhaustion dulled the sharp edges. Everyone knew the harbour itself had been the true thief, and no knife or axe could reclaim what had been swallowed. Practical minds set to salvaging what remained. Crews baled water from the hold's patched cracks and dragged ruined cargo onto sledges. Women rinsed wool in icy water, hoping the smell might lift. Men chopped spoiled meat for dogs. A few clever souls gathered hardened fish, now brittle as stone, and amused themselves by carving them into charms. One child wore a fishtail pendant around her neck, declaring it a gift from the harbour. Her father shook his head, but let her keep it, muttering that even curses deserve souvenirs. Humour returned in small, weary bursts. A fisherman declared that the thaw was just another trick that the harbour would refreeze overnight out of spite. A smith replied that if it did, he would finally forge the skates he had threatened all week. A merchant surveying his ruined wares sighed and said the gods clearly wanted him to become a storyteller instead. The skald beside him laughed and offered lessons for a fee naturally. By nightfall, the bay was a chaos of floating shards, water sloshing between them ships, bobbing uncertainly like men relearning how to walk. The sound of cracking and splashing replaced the silence of earlier days. Fires burned along the shore, casting orange light across jagged plates that gleamed like shattered glass. The air smelled fresher, sharper, cleansed by motion, though the odour of spoilage lingered stubbornly. For Haithabu, the thaw was both an ending and a beginning. The ice had released its grip, but it had left scars, spoiled good strained friendships, and a story that would be told for generations. The harbour no longer seemed a simple stretch of water. It had become a presence, a force with moods of its own. People spoke of it with caution as if it were listening, and perhaps it was. The thaw did not end the mystery. If anything, it deepened it. For though the harbour of Haithabu was once again liquid flowing and restless, the memory of its sudden freeze clung to every tongue. By the 9th day, ships rocked in the water, cargo half-salvaged, people weary from labour, yet the questions remained louder than the creak of timbers. How could a bay that size turn to stone in a single night, then melt away just as quickly? Why did no gradual signs appear? No warning of frost before the solid wall, no slow softening before the collapse. Historians still argue whether the tale is history or legend. Some maintain that the freeze must have been exaggerated, a story grown fat with retelling. Others insist that unusual weather can perform such tricks, rare but not impossible. Modern scholars add possibilities: volcanic haze drifting unseen from an eruption far to the south, lowering temperatures in a single evening. An unusual surge of fresh water from inland rivers dropping the freezing point just enough. Or even a sudden calm wind that allowed heat to bleed into the sky. Each explanation feels neat until weighed against the astonishment of those who lived it. Their voices, though filtered through centuries, refuse neatness. They describe not a gradual event, but a transformation like magic. Quirky theories sprouted even in the years that followed. A chronicler in Saxony recorded that perhaps giants had laid their hands on the bay, testing its strength. A monk in Denmark suggested it was a miracle meant to rebuke pagans, though his account contradicts itself 3 lines later. Skalds in Iceland sang verses of Loki smothering the harbour in laughter, his joke cracking a week later when he grew bored. Each story carries the fingerprints of its teller, yet all share the same core: Haithabu's harbour froze without reason and thawed without mercy. The mainstream fact is that Haithabu was a place of note, wealthy enough that its quirks were worth recording. Unlike a small fishing hamlet whose troubles might vanish unremembered, Haithabu sat at the hinge of Europe's north. What happened here travelled quickly in gossip and in ink. That the frozen harbour entered legend is no surprise. that it has never been neatly explained is the reason we still talk about it today. Archaeologists have dug the soil around Haithabu for decades, unearthing longhouses, jewellery combs, coins and fragments of trade goods from far and wide. Yet they have found no clear evidence of the Great Freeze, no drowned ships, preserved mid-prison, no unusual sediment line to confirm an ice sheet. Some take this absence as proof that the event was exaggerated. Others reply that a week of ice leaves little trace in the ground, especially when followed by centuries of tide erosion and rebuilding. The lack of physical proof does not erase the voices that spoke of it. Instead, it sharpens the tension between history and memory. Debates stretch beyond the academy. Enthusiasts of folklore point out that the Norse world lived by a porous border between myth and fact. To them, the frozen harbour is less a meteorological puzzle and more a story about vulnerability, about how even the proudest port can be humbled overnight. Skeptics counter that such tales reflect the human need for drama, that merchants exaggerated their losses until the ice became a curse worthy of Odin's wrath. Somewhere between these poles, the story holds its shape, refusing to melt entirely into either camp. Quirky tidbits continue to surface in modern retellings. In one account, preserved in a later saga, a traveller swore that when the ice broke he saw fish leap into the air, as though startled awake, their bodies flashing like silver coins in sunlight. Another version tells of a runestone carved to commemorate the event, though none has ever been found. These details may be inventions, or they may be echoes of real sights and sounds blurred by memory. The absence of certainty keeps the story alive. Humour remains part of the legacy. Later skulls teased that Haithabu's merchants deserved the freeze for charging too much for furs. Others joke that the harbour was jealous of the silver it carried and wanted to keep it for itself. Even centuries later, the story could make listeners chuckle. Mystery and laughter are kin, both born of surprise. Modern minds, with all their instruments, still stumble at the puzzle. Could the freeze have been an exaggerated version of a typical northern winter storm, perhaps? Could volcanic ash from Iceland, or even far-off eruptions in the Mediterranean, have drifted silently overhead, dropping the temperature possible? Could sudden changes in salinity from floods upstream have altered the water enough to snap into ice conceivable? But none of these explanations account for the swiftness, or for the eerie details, the silence, the sounds, the animals' strange behaviour. Scholars return to the same phrase again and again. Historians still argue whether the phenomenon can be fully explained. That admission, gentle and stubborn, is the echo of the harbour itself. For the people of Haithabu, the thaw did not resolve their fear. It reminded them that the world was capable of transformation beyond their control. They rebuilt, they traded, they laughed again, but they carried with them the memory of that week when ships became statues and silence ruled the market. Some told the story as a warning, others as a marvel, and some as a joke. Each retelling added a layer of ice or melted one away. By the 9th night, Haithabu looked outward again, preparing to resume the rhythm of trade. Yet beneath the bustle, questions lingered like embers under ash. Had they been cursed, protected, tested? Or had they simply been caught in nature's grip, one that could return without notice, no answer satisfied? And so the frozen harbour remained not just an episode, but a riddle suspended between fact and faith, between ledger and legend. By the 10th day, Haithabu's harbour had returned to water, its ice broken into drifting shards that knocked together like glass goblets chiming gently in the current. Yet the memory of its imprisonment lingered over the town like a low cloud. Men stood on the quayside with arms folded, staring at the restless water, as if expecting it to harden again before their eyes. Women hung laundry in the brittle sunlight, glancing at the bay as though the cloth itself might freeze on the line. Children whispered games about which God would return to trap the ships next. The harbour, though free, was not innocent anymore. The legacy of the ice was everywhere. Goods spoiled, debts, unpayable alliances strained. Merchants cursed their losses in every language that passed through Haithabu, and neighbours whispered about who had stolen what in the panic. Yet even as tempers flared, the town carried on. Ships were repaired, markets reopened, fires rekindled in forges. Life like the tide returned. But the strange week of silence and stillness left a bruise beneath the skin of ordinary days. Historians still argue whether this bruise was cultural memory or climatic reality. Was the freeze a natural event magnified by fear, or a myth that grew fat on repetition? Some scholars say the story reflects the fragility of trade, the dependence of Viking wealth on elements they could not command. Others suggest it became a parable told by Christian monks as proof that pagan prosperity was shallow, or by pagan skalds, as a reminder that even mighty harbours could be humbled. The mystery endures because it serves too many masters: history, faith, legend, and imagination. Quirky tales, meanwhile, cling to the edges of the legend. A later saga claims that one of the ruined barrels was carved into a cradle, and that the child rocked in it grew to be a great sailor. Another story insists that when the harbour thawed, a single bead from the scattered crate washed ashore each spring for 7 years, always gleaming brighter than the rest. These details are unverifiable, but they give the mystery texture like frost patterns curling on glass. They are part of why the story still feels alive centuries after the ice itself has gone. The mainstream fact is that Haithabu continued to prosper after the event. Archaeology reveals thriving trade well into the 11th century before war, and fire finally ended the town. The frozen harbour did not destroy it. If anything, it became part of its identity, proof that Haithabu had faced the impossible and survived. The Danavuk was extended, the markets grew coins, and beads kept flowing. Yet the tale of the week when the bay froze remained one of the town's defining memories, retold long after the ships had sailed again. Humour too outlasted the ice. A fisherman joked that the harbour had simply wanted a holiday. A blacksmith teased that his ruined tools at least proved he'd swung harder than any god. A skald performed verses where Loki himself apologised for the prank, promising never to freeze another port except perhaps in Francia. Laughter, once brittle, grew stronger with time. People remembered not only the silence and the loss, but also the absurd moments: the cheese rolling like a moon, the beads scattered like treasure, the barrel that refused to move. The mystery became less of a wound, and more of a scar, something to show with a rueful grin. Modern scholars sifting these fragments still debate. Was the event a brief freeze stretched into myth? Was it a climatic anomaly we cannot replicate in models? Or was it, as folklore insists, a visitation by forces beyond measure? No conclusion has triumphed. The harbour of Haithabu remains a riddle preserved in ink and memory, immune to final explanation. And perhaps that is fitting. After all, mystery feeds the imagination more than certainty ever could. By the 10th night, the town settled into uneasy calm. Ships rocked freely at their moorings, gulls returned to squabble, and the familiar stink of fish replaced the eerie silence. Life resumed, but the people who lived through the freeze carried the story with them, passing it to their children and grandchildren. They spoke of a week when the world turned upside down, when the harbour became a mirror of ice, when sound itself seemed to vanish. They told it as warning, as joke, as wonder, and in the telling they ensured that the harbour of Haithabu would never quite return to ordinary water. And so, as the story of Haithabu's frozen harbour draws to a close, let the mind soften its grip on questions without answers. The mystery has lingered for centuries, not because it offered a solution, but because it refused to be solved. Some say nature alone crafted the ice. Others insist it was a curse or a miracle. Yet in the quiet of night, when wind drifts softly through rafters and fire burns low, it hardly matters which tale is true. Imagine yourself beside the quay long after the voices have faded. The harbour stretches before you, no longer locked, but still holding a shimmer of memory, as if the water itself recalls its week of silence. The ships rock gently, timbers creaking in a rhythm older than speech. The air carries no groans, no knocks, only the faint sigh of tide against the shore. What was once unsettling now feels calm, like the slow breathing of a sleeper at peace. Let your thoughts drift with that tide. Picture the shards of ice dissolving one by one, slipping quietly into the water, leaving only ripples that fade into stillness. With each ripple, the body softens, shoulders easing, breath lengthening. Worries loosen their knots, drifting out like driftwood carried to sea. Even the questions how, why, when become lighter, no longer demanding answers, simply floating away. The harbour is water again. The town sleeps, and you too may rest, held gently by the same silence that once unsettled the people of Haithabu. For silence can be cruel, but it can also be kind, a blanket laid across weary minds. So close your eyes now, let the harbour's mystery settle like snow, and surrender to the comfort of night.